Okay, I want to talk now about how the Federal Reserve conducts its business and how it tries to control the ups and downs of the economy. First, we have to talk about the money supply. And the money supply is you put it into two categories, M1 and M2. M1 is easily gotten money. It's either in your pocket, or it's in traveler's checks, or it's in a checking account. It's very, very easy to get. M2 is everything that's in M1, but it's also savings, deposits, and money market mutual funds. Things that you can get fairly quickly, but you can't do it as quickly as you can in the categories of M1. So that's the money supply. That's money that people can relatively easily get their hands on and spend. And the next chart shows how it looked, at least at one time in the United States. I think it's 2012. The M1, the really fast, easily obtained money, was at around 2.5 trillion, and the M1 and M2 together were about 10.5 trillion, roughly. All right, so a lot of money. Now, what is the Federal Reserve? Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. And the job of the central bank is to oversee the banking system so that everything runs smoothly, and also to regulate the quantity of money in the economy. The reason we had the Great Depression in the 30s was that the Federal Reserve was a very, very young institution at that time, and they didn't know everything they know today. And they made mistakes in how they were handling the quantity of money. And what they did was they starved the country of money. They made M1 and M2 way too small for the demands of the people and the businesses to engage in market activity. So market activity came to a screeching halt. And since then, they've been a lot wiser and a lot smarter on how to control the money. So what that is their job, to control the quantity of money. They have to establish a monetary policy, and let me say what I think will suffice to say what their policy is. They pick an inflation rate of around 2%. That's the inflation rate they would like to target. They don't want the inflation rate to be negative. If it were negative, that means prices are going down. That means people won't buy today because they're waiting for the price to go down tomorrow. And when everyone stands around with their money in their pocket and they don't spend it because they're waiting for prices to go down, the economy comes to a screeching halt. And unemployment soars. It is not good. So you always want the money supply to be great enough such that you're creating a slight amount of inflation, but not a lot of inflation, which is very, very bad also. So what they've determined over the years is that they'd like to target about 2% inflation. And they definitely want it to be positive, not negative. So they then have to try to control the money supply. Well, they can't just easily do that. The best way that they've learned to do the controlling of the money supply is by controlling the interest rates. Okay, it's kind of how they get around to doing it. Okay, so they have what they call the Federal Open Market Committee. This is the 7 members of the Board of Governors, and they meet and decide, do they think the economy is overheating? If they do, they will take steps to raise interest rates to reduce the money supply, which will raise interest rates, and it will slow the economy down, trying to get it back down towards the 2% goal. If they see it the other way, then they'll take opposite action. I'm going to show you a little bit about how they go about doing that. Their primary tool for the Federal Reserve is the Open Market Committee, where they go into the government bond business. They own a bunch of government bonds. They buy and sell government bonds, and when they want to increase the money supply, they make what's called an open market purchase. They go in and take their money, the Federal Reserve's money, and they buy bonds, which takes money out of the money supply. The people that were holding money, either in M1 and M2, write checks to buy bonds when the Fed wants to reduce the amount of money, and they sell bonds to the Fed when they want the money supply to be reduced. All right, I think I said that right. I'm going to re-say it. I'm going to re-say it here in a minute. There's also a money multiplier, so they have to be aware of that. Every little change they make multiplies to the economy, because the bank doesn't have 100% of the money they lent out on hand in the bank. They have what's called a reserve requirement. The reserve requirement is in the neighborhood of 6% right now, I think, which means that the amount of money that's actually in the bank that they have as assets is 6% of the money they've lent out to everyone. Okay, the assumption being that not everyone will come at the very same time and want all their money being taken out, and that there's not everybody that they've lent money to will fail to repay them. So the Federal Reserve decides what the reserve ratio ought to be, and the banks have to follow that. They cannot lend money out to the point that they lower their reserves below 6% of the amount of money that they loaned out. All right, now, next slide. So the money multiplier, if you want to look at the mathematics of it, the money multiplier is 1 over the reserve rate. So let's say the reserve rate was 10%. The money multiplier would be 1 divided by 0.1, that's 10. So every dollar that is every dollar that's in the banking system lends out ends up multiplying 10 times as it moves through the economy. Okay, it goes from one hand to another. It's been multiplied 10 times. All right, if the reserve ratio is 0.1. All right. So how does the Fed control money? One way they can do it is by changing the quantity of reserves. They do not use that a lot, but they could. If they want to slow the economy down, they could tell banks that 6% reserve ratio, make it 10. It needs to be 10%, which means the amount of money you lent out, you have to have 10% of that as assets that you own. And that would mean the banks that were operating at 6% would have to stop lending money, like right now, and start calling in loans to get their assets up to the proper number. And that would slow the economy down. All right. The other way they do it is with the open market operations, the purchase and sale of U.S. government bonds by the Fed. If they want to increase the money supply, they buy government bonds. So when the Fed takes their money and buys a government bond, they have to place that money into someone's checking account. And when they place that money into someone's checking account, they have just increased the money supply. M1 has just gone up. Okay. When they want to reduce the money supply, the Fed sells government bonds. So they hold government bonds and they have cash. And that's how they decide to either increase or decrease the money supply. What they do is just make those purchases or sales depending on which direction they want to go. Okay? So the bottom line then, the last slide, the Fed, to target the federal funds rate, they have open market operations. What they do is they buy bonds, which decreases the federal funds rate and increases the money supply, or they sell bonds, which increases the federal funds rate and decreases the money supply. If you have any questions on this, please let me know. Thanks.